The History of the Telephone by Herbert Casson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by J. Randolph. Chapter 1. The Birth of the Telephone. In that somewhat distant year 1875, when the telegraph and the Atlantic cable were the most wonderful things in the world, a tall young professor of elocution was desperately busy in a noisy machine shop that stood in one of the narrow streets of Boston, not far from Scollay Square. It was a very hot afternoon in June, but the young professor had forgotten the heat and the grime of the workshop. He was wholly absorbed in the making of a nondescript machine, a sort of crude harmonica with a clock spring reed, a magnet, and a wire. It was a most absurd toy in appearance. It was unlike any other thing that had ever been made in any country. The young professor had been toiling over it for 3 years, and it had constantly baffled him until, on this hot afternoon in June 1875, he heard an almost inaudible sound, a faint twang, come from the machine itself. For an instant he was stunned. He had been expecting just such a sound for several months, but it came so suddenly as to give him the sensation of surprise. His eyes blazed with delight, and he sprang in a passion of eagerness to an adjoining room in which stood a young mechanic who was assisting him. "Snap that reed again, Watson!" cried the apparently irrational young professor. There was one of the odd-looking machines in each room, so it appears, and the two were connected by an electric wire. Watson had snapped the reed on one of the machines, and the professor had heard from the other machine exactly the same sound. It was no more than the gentle twang of a clock spring, but it was the first time in the history of the world that a complete sound had been carried along a wire, reproduced perfectly at the other end, and heard by an expert in acoustics. That twang of the clock spring was the first tiny cry of the newborn telephone, uttered into the clanging din of a machine shop and happily heard by a man whose ear had been trained to recognize the strange voice of the little newcomer. There, amidst flying belts and jarring wheels, the baby telephone was born, as feeble and helpless as any other baby, and with no language but a cry. The professor-inventor, who had thus rescued the tiny foundling of science, was a young Scottish-American. His name, now known as widely as the telephone itself, was Alexander Graham Bell. He was a teacher of acoustics and a student of electricity, possibly the only man in his generation who was able to focus a knowledge of both subjects upon the problem of the telephone. To other men, that exceedingly faint sound would have been as inaudible as silence itself. But to Bell it was a thunderclap. It was a dream come true. It was an impossible thing which had in a flash become so easy that he could scarcely believe it. Here, without the use of a battery, with no more electric current than that made by a couple of magnets, all the waves of a sound had been carried along a wire and changed back to sound at the farther end. It was absurd. It was incredible. It was something which neither wire nor electricity had been known to do before. But it was true. No discovery has ever been less accidental. It was the last link of a long chain of discoveries. It was the result of a persistent and deliberate search. Already, for half a year or longer, Bell had known the correct theory of the telephone, but he had not realized that the feeble undulatory current generated by a magnet was strong enough for the transmission of speech. He had been taught to undervalue the incredible efficiency of electricity. Not only was Bell himself a teacher of the laws of speech, so highly skilled that he was an instructor in Boston University, his father also, his 2 brothers, his uncle, and his grandfather had taught the laws of speech in the universities of Edinburgh, Dublin, and London. For 3 generations, the Bells had been professors of the science of talking. They had even helped to create that science by several inventions. The first of them, Alexander Bell, had invented a system for the correction of stammering and similar defects of speech. The second, Alexander Melville Bell, was the dean of British elocutionists, a man of creative brain and a most impressive facility of rhetoric. He was the author of a dozen textbooks on the art of speaking correctly, and also of a most ingenious sign language which he called visible speech. Every letter in the alphabet of this language represented a certain action of the lips and tongue, so that a new method was provided for those who wished to learn foreign languages or to speak their own language more correctly. And the third of these speech-improving Bells, the inventor of the telephone, inherited the peculiar genius of his fathers, both inventive and rhetorical, to such a degree that as a boy he had constructed an artificial skull from gutta percha and Indian rubber, which, when enlivened by a blast of air from a hand bellows, would actually pronounce several words in an almost human manner. The third Bell, the only one of this remarkable family who concerns us at this time, was a young man, barely 28, at the time when his ear caught the first cry of the telephone. But he was already a man of some note on his own account. He had been educated in Edinburgh, the city of his birth, and in London, and had in one way and another picked up a smattering of anatomy, music, electricity, and telegraphy. Until he was 16 years of age, he had read nothing but novels and poetry and romantic tales of Scottish heroes. Then he left home to become a teacher of elocution in various British schools, and by the time he was of age, he had made several slight discoveries as to the nature of vowel sounds. Shortly afterwards, he met in London 2 distinguished men, Alexander J. Ellis and Sir Charles Wheatstone, who did far more than they ever knew to forward Bell in the direction of the telephone. Ellis was the president of the London Philological Society. Also, he was the translator of the famous book on The Sensations of Tone, written by Helmholtz, who, in the period from 1871 to 1894, made Berlin the world center for the study of the physical sciences. So it happened that when Bell ran to Ellis as a young enthusiast and told his experiments, Ellis informed him that Helmholtz had already done the same thing several years before, and had done them much more completely. He brought Bell to his house and showed him what Helmholtz had done, how he had kept tuning forks in vibration by the power of electromagnets, and blended the tones of several tuning forks together to produce the complex quality of the human voice. Now, Helmholtz had not been trying to invent a telephone or any sort of message carrier. His aim was to point out the physical basis of music, and nothing more. But this fact that an electromagnet would set a tuning fork humming was new to Bell and very attractive. It appealed at once to him as a student of speech. If a tuning fork could be made to sing by a magnet or an electrified wire, why would it not be possible to make a musical telegraph, a telegraph with a piano keyboard, so that many messages could be sent at once over a single wire? Unknown to Bell, there were several dozen inventors then at work upon this problem, which proved in the end to be very elusive. But it gave him at least a starting point, and he forthwith commenced his quest of the telephone. As he was then in England, his first step was naturally to visit Sir Charles Wheatstone, the best-known English expert on telegraphy. Sir Charles had earned his title by many inventions. He was a simple-natured scientist and treated Bell with the utmost kindness. He showed him an ingenious talking machine that had been made by Baron de Kempelen. At this time Bell was 22 and unknown. Wheatstone was 67 and famous. And the personality of the veteran scientist made so vivid a picture upon the mind of the impressionable young Bell that the grand passion of science became henceforth the master motif of his life. From this summit of glorious ambition, he was thrown, several months later, into the depths of grief and despondency. The White Plague had come to the home in Edinburgh and taken away his two brothers. More, it had put its mark upon the young inventor himself. Nothing but a change of climate, said his doctor, would put him out of danger. And so, to save his life, he and his father and mother set sail from Glasgow and came to the small Canadian town of Brantford, where for a year he fought down his tendency to consumption and satisfied his nervous energy by teaching visible speech to a tribe of Mohawk Indians. By this time it had become evident, both to his parents and to his friends, that young Graham was destined to become some sort of a creative genius. He was tall and supple, with a pale complexion, large nose, full lips, jet-black eyes, and jet-black hair, brushed high and usually rumpled into a curly tangle. In temperament, he was a true scientific bohemian, with the ideals of a savant and the disposition of an artist. He was wholly a man of enthusiasms, more devoted to ideas than to people, and less likely to master his own thoughts than to be mastered by them. He had no shrewdness in any commercial sense, and very little knowledge of the small practical details of ordinary living. He was always intense, always absorbed. When he applied his mind to a problem, it became at once an enthralling arena in which there went whirling a chariot race of ideas and inventive fancies. He had been fascinated from boyhood by his father's system of visible speech. He knew it so well that he once astonished a professor of Oriental languages by repeating correctly a sentence of Sanskrit that had been written in visible speech characters. While he was living in London, his most absorbing enthusiasm was the instruction of a class of deaf-mutes, who could be trained to talk, he believed, by means of the visible speech alphabet. He was so deeply impressed by the progress made by these pupils, and by the pathos of their dumbness, that when he arrived in Canada he was in doubt as to which of these two tasks was the more important, the teaching of deaf-mutes or the invention of a musical telegraph. At this point, and before Bell had begun to experiment with his telegraph, the scene of the story shifts from Canada to Massachusetts. It appears that his father, while lecturing in Boston, had mentioned Graham's exploits with a class of deaf-mutes, and soon afterward the Boston Board of Education wrote to Graham offering him $500 if he would come to Boston and introduce his system of teaching in a school for deaf-mutes that had been opened recently. The young man joyfully agreed, and on the 1st of April, 1871, crossed the line and became, for the remainder of his life, an American. For the next 2 years his telegraphic work was laid aside, if not forgotten. His success as a teacher of deaf-mutes was sudden and overwhelming. It was the educational sensation of 1871. It won him a professorship in Boston University, and brought so many pupils around him that he ventured to open an ambitious School of Vocal Physiology, which became at once a profitable enterprise. For a time there seemed to be little hope of his escaping from the burden of this success and becoming an inventor, when, by a most happy coincidence, 2 of his pupils brought to him exactly the sort of stimulation and practical help that he needed and had not up to this time received. One of these pupils was a little deaf-mute tot, 5 years of age, named Georgie Sanders. Bell had agreed to give him a series of private lessons for $350 a year, and as the child lived with his grandmother in the city of Salem, 16 miles from Boston, it was agreed that Bell should make his home with the Sanders family. Here he not only found the keenest interest and sympathy in his air castles of invention, but also was given permission to use the cellar of the house as his workshop. For the next 3 years this cellar was his favorite retreat. He littered it with tuning forks, magnets, batteries, coils of wire, tin trumpets, and cigar boxes. No one outside of the Sanders family was allowed to enter it, as Bell was nervously afraid of having his ideas stolen. He would even go to 5 or 6 stores to buy his supplies, for fear that his intentions should be discovered. Almost with the secrecy of a conspirator, he worked alone in this cellar, usually at night, and quite oblivious of the fact that sleep was a necessity to him and to the Sanders family. "Often in the middle of the night Bell would wake me up," said Thomas Sanders, the father of Georgie. "His black eyes would be blazing with excitement. Leaving me to go down to the cellar, he would rush wildly to the barn and begin to send me signals along his experimental wires. If I noticed any improvement in his machine, he would be delighted. He would leap and whirl around in one of his war dances and then go contentedly to bed. But if the experiment was a failure, he would go back to his workbench and try some different plan." The second pupil who became a factor, a very considerable factor, in Bell's career was a 15-year-old girl named Mabel Hubbard, who had lost her hearing, and consequently her speech, through an attack of scarlet fever when a baby. She was a gentle and lovable girl, and Bell, in his ardent and headlong way, lost his heart to her completely, and 4 years later he had the happiness of making her his wife. Mabel Hubbard did much to encourage Bell. She followed each step of his progress with the keenest interest. She wrote his letters and copied his patents. She cheered him on when he felt himself beaten. And through her sympathy with Bell and his ambitions, she led her father, a widely known Boston lawyer named Gardner G. Hubbard, to become Bell's chief spokesman and defender, a true apostle of the telephone. Hubbard first became aware of Bell's inventive efforts one evening when Bell was visiting at his home in Cambridge. Bell was illustrating some of the mysteries of acoustics by the aid of a piano. "Do you know," he said to Hubbard, "that if I sing the note G close to the strings of the piano, that the G string will answer me?" "Well, what then?" asked Hubbard. "It is a fact of tremendous importance," replied Bell. "It is an evidence that we may some day have a musical telegraph, which will send as many messages simultaneously over one wire as there are notes on that piano." Later, Bell ventured to confide to Hubbard his wild dream of sending speech over an electric wire, but Hubbard laughed him to scorn. "Now you are talking nonsense," he said. "Such a thing never could be more than a scientific toy. You had better throw that idea out of your mind and go ahead with your musical telegraph, which, if it is successful, will make you a millionaire." But the longer Bell toiled at his musical telegraph, the more he dreamed of replacing the telegraph and its cumbersome sign language by a new machine that would carry, not dots and dashes, but the human voice. "If I can make a deaf-mute talk," he said, "I can make iron talk." For months he wavered between the two ideas. He had no more than the most hazy conception of what this voice-carrying machine would be like. At first he conceived of having a harp at one end of the wire and a speaking trumpet at the other, so that the tones of the voice would be reproduced by the strings of the harp. Then, in the early summer of 1874, while he was puzzling over this harp apparatus, the dim outline of a new path suddenly glinted in front of him. He had not been forgetful of visible speech all this while, but had been making experiments with two remarkable machines, the phonautograph and the manometric capsule, by means of which the vibrations of sound were made plainly visible. If these could be improved, he thought, then the deaf might be taught to speak by sight, by learning an alphabet of vibrations. He mentioned these experiments to a Boston friend, Dr. Clarence J. Blake, and he, being a surgeon and an aurist, naturally said, "Why don't you use a real ear?" Such an idea never had, and probably never could have, occurred to Bell, but he accepted it with eagerness. Dr. Blake cut an ear from a dead man's head, together with the eardrum and the associated bones. Bell took this fragment of a skull and arranged it so that a straw touched the eardrum at one end and a piece of moving smoked glass at the other. Thus, when Bell spoke loudly into the ear, the vibrations of the drum made tiny markings upon the glass. It was one of the most extraordinary incidents in the whole history of the telephone. To an uninitiated onlooker, nothing could have been more ghastly or absurd. How could anyone have interpreted the gruesome joy of this young professor with the pale face and the black eyes, who stood earnestly singing, whispering, and shouting into a dead man's ear? What sort of a wizard must he be, or ghoul, or madman? And in Salem, too, the home of the witchcraft superstition. Certainly it would not have gone well with Bell had he lived 2 centuries earlier and been caught at such black magic. What had this dead man's ear to do with the invention of the telephone? Much. Bell noticed how small and thin was the eardrum, and yet how effectively it could send thrills and vibrations through heavy bones. If this tiny disc can vibrate a bone, he thought, then an iron disc might vibrate an iron rod, or at least an iron wire. In a flash, the conception of a membrane telephone was pictured in his mind. He saw in imagination 2 iron discs, or eardrums, far apart and connected by an electrified wire, catching the vibrations of sound at one end and reproducing them at the other. At last he was on the right path, and had a theoretical knowledge of what a speaking telephone ought to be. What remained to be done was to construct such a machine and find out how the electric current could best be brought into harness. Then, as though fortune suddenly felt that he was winning this stupendous success too easily, Bell was flung back by an avalanche of troubles. Sanders and Hubbard, who had been paying the cost of his experiments, abruptly announced that they would pay no more unless he confined his attention to the musical telegraph, and stopped wasting his time on ear toys that never could be of any financial value. What these 2 men asked could scarcely be denied, as one of them was his best-paying patron, and the other was the father of the girl whom he hoped to marry. "If you wish to marry my daughter," said Hubbard, "you must abandon your foolish telephone." Bell's school of vocal physiology, too, from which he had hoped so much, had come to an inglorious end. He had been too much absorbed in his experiments to sustain it. His professorship had been given up, and he had no pupils except Georgie Sanders and Mabel Hubbard. He was poor, much poorer than his associates knew, and his mind was torn and distracted by the contrary calls of science, poverty, business, and affection. Pouring out his sorrows in a letter to his mother, he said, "I am now beginning to realize the cares and anxieties of being an inventor. I have had to put off all pupils and classes, for flesh and blood could not stand much longer such a strain as I have had upon me." While stumbling through this slough of despond, he was called to Washington by his patent lawyer. Not having enough money to pay the cost of such a journey, he borrowed the price of a return ticket from Sanders, and arranged to stay with a friend in Washington to save a hotel bill that he could not afford. At that time, Professor Joseph Henry, who knew more of the theory of electrical science than any other American, was the grand old man of Washington, and poor Bell, in his doubt and desperation, resolved to run to him for advice. Then came a meeting which deserves to be historic. For an entire afternoon the 2 men worked together over the apparatus that Bell had brought from Boston, just as Henry had worked over the telegraph before Bell was born. Henry was now a veteran of 78, with only 3 years remaining to his credit in the bank of time, while Bell was 28. There was a long half-century between them, but the youth had discovered a new fact that the sage, in all his wisdom, had never known. "You are in possession of the germ of a great invention," said Henry, "and I would advise you to work at it until you have made it complete." "But," Bell replied, "I have not got the electrical knowledge that is necessary." "Get it," responded the aged scientist. "I cannot tell you how much these 2 words have encouraged me," Bell said afterwards in describing this interview to his parents. "I live too much in an atmosphere of discouragement for scientific pursuits, and such a chimerical idea as telegraphing vocal sounds would indeed seem to most minds scarcely feasible enough to spend time in working over." By this time Bell had moved his workshop from the cellar in Salem to 109 Court Street in Boston, where he had rented a room from Charles Williams, a manufacturer of electrical supplies. Thomas A. Watson was his assistant, and both Bell and Watson lived nearby in 2 cheap little bedrooms. The rent of the workshop and bedrooms and Watson's wages of $9 a week were being paid by Sanders and Hubbard. Consequently, when Bell returned from Washington, he was compelled by his agreement to devote himself mainly to the musical telegraph, although his heart was now with the telephone. For exactly 3 months after his interview with Professor Henry, he continued to plod ahead along both lines until, on that memorable hot afternoon in June 1875, the full twang of the clock spring came over the wire, and the telephone was born. From this moment, Bell was a man of one purpose. He won over Sanders and Hubbard. He converted Watson into an enthusiast. He forgot his musical telegraph, his visible speech classes, his poverty. He threw aside a profession in which he was already locally famous, and he grappled with this new mystery of electricity, as Henry had advised him to do, encouraging himself with the fact that Morse, who was only a painter, had mastered his electrical difficulties, and there was no reason why a professor of acoustics could not do as much. The telephone was now in existence, but it was the youngest and feeblest thing in the nation. It had not yet spoken a word. It had to be taught, developed, and made fit for the service of the irritable business world. All manner of discs had to be tried, some smaller and thinner than a dime, and others of steel boilerplate as heavy as the shield of Achilles. In all the books of electrical science there was nothing to help Bell and Watson in this journey they were making through an unknown country. They were as chartless as Columbus was in 1492. Neither they nor anyone else had acquired any experience in the rearing of a young telephone. No one knew what to do next. There was nothing to know. For 40 weeks, long, exasperating weeks, the telephone could do no more than gasp and make strange, inarticulate noises. Its educators had not learned how to manage it. Then, on March 10th, 1876, it talked. It said distinctly, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you." Watson, who was at the lower end of the wire, in the basement, dropped the receiver and rushed with wild joy up 3 flights of stairs to tell the glad tidings to Bell. "I can hear you," he shouted breathlessly. "I can hear the words." It was not easy, of course, for the weak young telephone to make itself heard in that noisy workshop. No one, not even Bell and Watson, was familiar with its odd little voice. Usually Watson, who had a remarkably keen sense of hearing, did the listening, and Bell, who was a professional elocutionist, did the talking. And day by day the tone of the baby instrument grew clearer, a new note in the orchestra of civilization. On his 29th birthday, Bell received his patent, number 174,465, the most valuable single patent ever issued in any country. He had created something so entirely new that there was no name for it in any of the world's languages. In describing it to the officials of the Patent Office, he was obliged to call it an improvement in telegraphy, when in truth it was nothing of the kind. It was as different from the telegraph as the eloquence of a great orator is from the sign language of a deaf-mute. Other inventors had worked from the standpoint of the telegraph, and they never did, and never could, get any better results than signs and symbols. But Bell worked from the standpoint of the human voice. He cross-fertilized the 2 sciences of acoustics and electricity. His study of visible speech had trained his mind so that he could mentally see the shape of a word as he spoke it. He knew what a spoken word was, and how it acted upon the air, or the ether, that carried its vibrations from the lips to the ear. He was a 3rd-generation specialist in the nature of speech, and he knew that for the transmission of spoken words there must be, a pulsatory action of the electric current which is the exact equivalent of the aerial impulses. Bell knew just enough about electricity, and not too much. He did not know the possible from the impossible. Had I known more about electricity and less about sound, he said, I would never have invented the telephone. What he had done was so amazing, so foolhardy, that no trained electrician could have thought of it. It was the very hardihood of invention, and yet it was not in any sense a chance discovery. It was the natural output of a mind that had been led to assemble just the right materials for such a product. As though the very stars in their courses were working for this young wizard with the talking wire, the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia opened its doors exactly 2 months after the telephone had learned to talk. Here was a superb opportunity to let the wide world know what had been done, and fortunately Hubbard was one of the Centennial Commissioners. By his influence, a small table was placed in the Department of Education, in a narrow space between a stairway and a wall, and on this table was deposited the first of the telephones. Bell had no intention of going to the Centennial himself. He was too poor. Sanders and Hubbard had never done more than pay his room rent and the expense of his experiments. For his 3 or 4 years of inventing he had received nothing as yet, nothing but his patent. In order to live, he had been compelled to reorganize his classes in visible speech and to pick up the raveled ends of his neglected profession. But one Friday afternoon, toward the end of June, his sweetheart, Mabel Hubbard, was taking the train for the Centennial, and he went to the depot to say goodbye. Here Miss Hubbard learned for the first time that Bell was not to go. She coaxed and pleaded, without effect. Then, as the train was starting to leave, leaving Bell on the platform, the affectionate young girl could no longer control her feelings, and was overcome by a passion of tears. At this the susceptible Bell, like a true Sir Galahad, dashed after the moving train and sprang aboard, without ticket or baggage, oblivious of his classes and his poverty, and of all else except this one maiden's distress. "I never saw a man," said Watson, "so much in love as Bell was." As it happened, this impromptu trip to the Centennial proved to be one of the most timely acts of his life. On the following Sunday afternoon the judges were to make a special tour of inspection, and Mr. Hubbard, after much trouble, had obtained a promise that they would spend a few minutes examining Bell's telephone. By this time it had been on exhibition for more than 6 weeks, without attracting the serious attention of anybody. When Sunday afternoon arrived, Bell was at his little table, nervous yet confident. But hour after hour went by, and the judges did not arrive. The day was intensely hot, and they had many wonders to examine. There was the first electric light, and the first grain binder, and the musical telegraph of Elisha Gray, and the marvelous exhibit of printing telegraphs shown by the Western Union Company. By the time they came to Bell's table, through a litter of school desks and blackboards, the hour was 7 o'clock, and every man in the party was hot, tired, and hungry. Several announced their intention of returning to their hotels. One took up a telephone receiver, looked at it blankly, and put it down again. He did not even place it to his ear. Another judge made a slighting remark which raised a laugh at Bell's expense. Then a most marvelous thing happened, such an incident as would make a chapter in the Arabian Nights Entertainments. Accompanied by his wife, the Empress Teresa, and by a bevy of courtiers, the Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro de Alcantara, walked into the room, advanced with both hands outstretched to the bewildered Bell, and said, "Professor Bell, I am delighted to see you again." The judges at once forgot the heat and the fatigue and the hunger. Who was this young inventor, with the pale complexion and black eyes, that he should be the friend of emperors? They did not know, and for the moment even Bell himself had forgotten, that Dom Pedro had once visited Bell's class of deaf-mutes at Boston University. He was especially interested in such humanitarian work and had recently helped to organize the first Brazilian school for deaf-mutes at Rio de Janeiro. And so, with the tall, blond-bearded Dom Pedro in the center, the assembled judges and scientists, there were fully 50 in all, entered with unusual zest into the proceedings of this first telephone exhibition. A wire had been strung from one end of the room to the other, and while Bell went to the transmitter, Dom Pedro took up the receiver and placed it to his ear. It was a moment of tense expectancy. No one knew clearly what was about to happen, when the Emperor, with a dramatic gesture, raised his head from the receiver and exclaimed with a look of utter amazement, "My God, it talks!" Next came to the receiver the oldest scientist in the group, the venerable Joseph Henry, whose encouragement to Bell had been so timely. He stopped to listen, and as one of the bystanders afterwards said, no one could forget the look of awe that came into his face as he heard that iron disc talking with a human voice. "This," said he, "comes nearer to overthrowing the doctrine of the conservation of energy than anything I ever saw." Then came Sir William Thomson, latterly known as Lord Kelvin. It was fitting that he should be there, for he was the foremost electrical scientist at that time in the world, and had been the engineer of the first Atlantic cable. He listened and learned what even he had not known before, that a solid metallic body could take up from the air all the countless varieties of vibrations produced by speech, and that these vibrations could be carried along a wire and reproduced exactly by a second metallic body. He nodded his head solemnly as he rose from the receiver. "It does speak," he said emphatically. "It is the most wonderful thing I have seen in America." So, one after another, this notable company of men listened to the voice of the first telephone, and the more they knew of science, the less they were inclined to believe their ears. The wiser they were, the more they wondered. To Henry and Thomson, the masters of electrical magic, this instrument was as surprising as it was to the man in the street, and both were noble enough to admit frankly their astonishment in the reports which they made as judges when they gave Bell a certificate of award. "Mr. Bell has achieved a result of transcendent scientific interest," wrote Sir William Thomson. "I heard it speak distinctly several sentences. I was astonished and delighted. It is the greatest marvel hitherto achieved by the electric telegraph." Until nearly 10 o'clock that night, the judges talked and listened by turns at the telephone. Then, next morning, they brought the apparatus to the judges' pavilion, where for the remainder of the summer it was mobbed by judges and scientists. Sir William Thomson and his wife ran back and forth between the two ends of the wire like a pair of delighted children. And thus it happened that the crude little instrument that had been tossed into an out-of-the-way corner became the star of the centennial. It had been given no more than 18 words in the official catalogue, and here it was acclaimed as the wonder of wonders. It had been conceived in a cellar and born in a machine shop, and now, of all the gifts that our young American Republic had received on its 100th birthday, the telephone was honored as the rarest and most welcome of them all. This is the end of Chapter 1 of The History of the Telephone. The History of the Telephone by Herbert N. Casson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by J. Randolph. Chapter 4. The Development of the Art. 4 wire-using businesses were already in the field when the telephone was born. The fire alarm, burglar alarm, telegraph, and messenger boy service. And at first, as might have been expected, the humble little telephone was huddled in with these businesses as a sort of poor relation. To the general public, it was a mere scientific toy. But there were a few men, not many, in these wire-stringing trades who saw a glimmering chance of creating a telephone business. They put telephones on the wires that were then in use. As these became popular, they added others. Each of their customers wished to be able to talk to everyone else. And so, having undertaken to give telephone service, they presently found themselves battling with the most intricate and baffling engineering problem of modern times: the construction around the telephone of such a mechanism as would bring it into universal service. The first of these men was Thomas A. Watson, the young mechanic who had been hired as Bell's helper. He began a work that today requires an army of 26,000 people. He was for a couple of years the total engineering and manufacturing department of the telephone business, and by 1880 had taken out 60 patents for his own suggestions. It was Watson who took the telephone as Bell had made it, really a toy, with its diaphragm so delicate that a warm breath would put it out of order, and toughened it into a more rugged machine. Bell had used a disc of fragile gold beater's skin with a patch of sheet iron glued to the center. He could not believe for a time that a disc of all iron would vibrate under the slight influence of a spoken word. But he and Watson noticed that when the patch was bigger, the talking was better, and presently they threw away the gold beater's skin and used the iron alone. Also, it was Watson who spent months experimenting with all sorts and sizes of iron discs, so as to get the one that would best convey the sound. If the iron was too thick, he discovered, the voice was shrilled into a Punch and Judy squeal, and if it was too thin, the voice became a hollow and sepulchral groan, as if the speaker had his head in a barrel. Other months, too, were spent in finding out the proper size and shape for the air cavity in front of the disc. And so, after the telephone had been perfected in principle, a full year was required to lift it out of the class of scientific toys, and another year or two to present it properly to the business world. Until 1878, all Bell telephone apparatus was made by Watson in Charles Williams' little shop in Court Street, Boston, a building long since transformed into a 5-cent theater. But the business soon grew too big for the shop. Orders fell 5 weeks behind. Agents stormed and fretted. Some action had to be taken quickly, so licenses were given to 4 other manufacturers to make bells, switchboards, and so forth. By this time, the Western Electric Company of Chicago had begun to make the infringing Gray Edison telephones for the Western Union, so that there were soon 6 groups of mechanics puzzling their wits over the new talk machinery. By 1880 there was plenty of telephonic apparatus being made, but in too many different varieties. Not all the summer gowns of that year presented more styles and fancies. The next step, if there was to be any degree of uniformity, was plainly to buy and consolidate these 6 companies. And by 1881, Vail had done this. It was the first merger in telephone history. It was a step of immense importance. Had it not been taken, the telephone business would have been torn into fragments by the civil wars between rival inventors. From this time, the Western Electric became the headquarters of all telephonic apparatus. It was the big shop. All roads led to it. No matter where a new idea was born, sooner or later it came knocking at the door of the Western Electric to receive a material body. Here were the skilled workmen who became the hands of the telephone business. And here, too, were many of the ablest inventors and engineers who did most to develop the cables and switchboards of today. In Boston, Watson had resigned in 1882, and in his place, a year or two later, stood a timely new arrival named E.T. Gilliland. This really notable man was a friend in need to the telephone. He had been a manufacturer of electrical apparatus in Indianapolis until Vail's policy of consolidation drew him into the central group of pioneers and pathfinders. For 5 years, Gilliland led the way as a developer of better and cheaper equipment. He made the best of a most difficult situation. He was so handy, so resourceful, that he invariably found a way to unravel the mechanical tangles that perplexed the first telephone agents, and this, too, without compelling them to spend large sums of capital. He took the ideas and apparatus that were then in existence and used them to carry the telephone business through the most critical period of its life, when there was little time or money to risk on experiments. He took the peg switchboard of the telegraph, for instance, and developed it to its highest point, to a point that was not even imagined possible by anyone else. It was the most practical and complete switchboard of its day, and held the field against all comers until it was superseded by the modern type of board, vastly more elaborate and expensive. By 1884, gathered around Gilliland in Boston and the Western Electric in Chicago, there came to be a group of mechanics and high school graduates, very young men mostly, who had no reputations to lose, and who, partly for a living and mainly for a lark, plunged into the difficulties of this new business that had at that time little history and less prestige. These young adventurers, most of whom are still alive, became the makers of industrial history. They were unquestionably the founders of the present science of telephone engineering. The problem that they dashed at so light-heartedly was much larger than any of them imagined. It was a Gibraltar of impossibilities. It was on the face of it a fantastic nightmare of a task, to weave such a web of wires with interlocking centers as would put any one telephone in touch with every other. There was no help for them in books or colleges. Watson, who had acquired a little knowledge, had become a shipbuilder. Electrical engineering as a profession was unborn. And as for their telegraphic experience, while it certainly helped them for a time, it started them in the wrong direction and led them to do many things which had afterwards to be undone. The peculiar electric current that these young pathfinders had to deal with is perhaps the quickest, feeblest, and most elusive force in the world. It is so amazing a thing that any description of it seems irrational. It is as gentle as a touch of a baby sunbeam, and as swift as the lightning flash. It is so small that the electric current of a single incandescent lamp is greater 500 million times. Cool a spoonful of hot water just 1 degree, and the energy set free by the cooling will operate a telephone for 10,000 years. Catch the falling teardrop of a child, and there will be sufficient water power to carry a spoken message from one city to another. Such is the tiny genie of the wire that had to be protected and trained into obedience. It was the most defenseless of all electric sprites, and it had so many enemies. Enemies! The world was populous with its enemies. There was the lightning, its elder brother, striking at it with murderous blows. There were the telegraphic and light and power currents, its strong and malicious cousins, chasing and assaulting it wherever it had ventured too near. There were rain and sleet and snow and every sort of moisture lying in wait to abduct it. There were rivers and trees and flecks of dust. It seemed as if all the known and unknown agencies of nature were in conspiracy to thwart or annihilate this gentle little messenger who had been conjured into life by the wizardry of Alexander Graham Bell. All that these young men had received from Bell and Watson was that part of the telephone that we call the receiver. This was practically the sum total of Bell's invention and remains today as he made it. It was then, and is yet, the most sensitive instrument that has ever been put to general use in any country. It opened up a new world of sound. It would echo the tramp of a fly that walked across a table, or repeat in New Orleans the prattle of a child in New York. This was what the young men received, and this was all. There were no switchboards of any account, no cables of any value, no wires that were in any sense adequate, no theory of tests or signals, no exchanges, no telephone system of any sort whatever. As for Bell's first telephone lines, they were as simple as clotheslines. Each short little wire stood by itself, with one instrument at each end. There were no operators, switchboards, or exchanges. But there had now come a time when more than two persons wanted to be in the same conversational group. This was a larger use of the telephone, and while Bell himself had foreseen it, he had not worked out a plan whereby it could be carried out. Here was the new problem, and a most stupendous one: how to link together 3 telephones, or 300, or 3,000, or 3,000,000, so that any 2 of them could be joined at a moment's notice. And that was not all. These young men had not only to battle against mystery and the powers of the air, they had not only to protect their tiny electric messenger and to create a system of wire highways along which he could run up and down safely, they had to do more. They had to make this system so simple and foolproof that everyone except the deaf and dumb, could use it without any previous experience. They had to educate Bell's genie of the wire so that he would not only obey his masters, but anybody who could speak to him in any language. No doubt, if the young men had stopped to consider their life work as a whole, some of them might have turned back. But they had no time to philosophize. They were like the boy who learns how to swim by being pushed into deep water. Once the telephone business was started, it had to be kept going. And as it grew, there came one after another a series of congestions. 2 courses were open. Either the business had to be kept down to suit the apparatus, or the apparatus had to be developed to keep pace with the business. The telephone men, most of them at least, chose development, and the brilliant inventions that afterward made some of them famous were compelled by sheer necessity and desperation. The first notable improvement upon Bell's invention was the making of the transmitter in 1877 by Emil Berliner. This, too, was a romance. Berliner, as a poor German youth of 19, had landed in Castle Garden in 1870 to seek his fortune. He got a job as a sort of bottle washer at $6 a week, he says, in a chemical shop in New York. At nights he studied science in the free classes of Cooper Union. Then a druggist named Engel gave him a copy of Müller's book on physics, which was precisely the stimulus needed by his creative brain. In 1876 he was fascinated by the telephone and set out to construct one on a different plan. Several months later he had succeeded and was overjoyed to receive his first patent for a telephone transmitter. He had by this time climbed up from his bottle washing to be a clerk in a dry goods store in Washington. But he was still poor and as unpractical as most inventors. Joseph Henry, the sage of the American scientific world, was his friend, though too old to give him any help. Consequently, when Edison, 2 weeks later, also invented a transmitter, the prior claim of Berliner was for a time wholly ignored. Later, the Bell Company bought Berliner's patent and took up his side of the case. There was a seemingly endless succession of delays, 14 years of the most vexatious delays, until finally the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Berliner, and not Edison, was the original inventor of the transmitter. From first to last, the transmitter has been the product of several minds. Its basic idea is the varying of the electric current by varying the pressure between 2 points. Bell unquestionably suggested it in his famous patent when he wrote of increasing and diminishing the resistance. Berliner was the first actually to construct one. Edison greatly improved it by using soft carbon instead of a steel point. A Kentucky professor, David E. Hughes, started a new line of development by adapting a Bell telephone into a microphone, a fantastic little instrument that would detect the noise made by a fly in walking across a table. Francis Blake of Boston changed a microphone into a practical transmitter. The Reverend Henry Hunnings, an English clergyman, hit upon the happy idea of using carbon in the form of small granules. And one of the Bell experts, named White, improved the Hunnings transmitter into its present shape. Both the transmitter and receiver seem now to be as complete an artificial tongue and ear as human ingenuity can make them. They have persistently grown more elaborate, until today a telephone set, as it stands on a desk, contains as many as 130 separate pieces, as well as a saltspoonful of glistening granules of carbon. Next after the transmitter came the problem of the mysterious noises. This was perhaps the most weird and mystifying of all the telephone problems. The fact was that the telephone had brought within hearing distance a new wonder world of sound. All wires at that time were single and ran into the earth at each end, making what was called a grounded circuit. And this connection with the earth, which is really a big magnet, caused all manner of strange and uncouth noises on the telephone. Noises! Such a jangle of meaningless noises had never been heard by human ears. There were spluttering and bubbling, jerking and rasping, whistling and screaming. There were the rustling of leaves, the croaking of frogs, the hissing of steam, and the flapping of birds' wings. There were clicks from telephone wires, scraps of talk from other telephones, and curious little squeals that were unlike any known sound. The lines running east and west were noisier than the lines running north and south. The night was noisier than the day, and at the ghostly hour of midnight, for what strange reason no one knows, the babble was at its height. Watson, who had a fanciful mind, suggested that perhaps these sounds were signals from the inhabitants of Mars or some other sociable planet. But the matter-of-fact young telephonists agreed to lay the blame on induction, a hazy word which usually meant the natural meddlesomeness of electricity. Whatever else the mysterious noises were, they were a nuisance. The poor little telephone business was plagued almost out of its senses. It was like a dog with a tin can tied to its tail. No matter where it went, it was pursued by this unearthly clatter. "We were ashamed to present our bills," said A. Adi, one of the first agents, "for no matter how plainly a man talked into his telephone, his language is apt to sound like Choctaw at the other end of the line." All manner of devices were solemnly tried to hush the wires, and each one usually proved to be as futile as an incantation. What was to be done? Step by step the telephone men were driven back. They were beaten. There was no way to silence these noises. Reluctantly they agreed that the only way was to pull up the ends of each wire from the tainted earth and join them by a second wire. This was the metallic circuit idea. It meant an appalling increase in the use of wire. It would compel the rebuilding of the switchboards and the invention of new signal systems. But it was inevitable, and in 1883, while the dispute about it was in full blast, one of the young men quietly slipped it into use on a new line between Boston and Providence. The effect was magical. "At last," said the delighted manager, "we have a perfectly quiet line." This young man, a small, slim youth who was 22 years old and looked younger, was no other than J. Carty, now the first of telephone engineers and almost the creator of his profession. 3 years earlier he had timidly asked for a job as operator in the Boston Exchange at $5 a week, and had shown such an aptitude for the work that he was soon made one of the captains. At 30 years of age, he became a central figure in the development of the art of telephony. What Carty has done is known by telephone men in all countries, but the story of Carty himself, who he is and why, is new. First of all, he is Irish, pure Irish. His father had left Ireland as a boy in 1825. During the Civil War, his father made guns in the city of Cambridge, where young John Joseph was born, and afterwards he made bells for church steeples. He was instinctively a mechanic and proud of his calling. He could tell the weight of a bell from the sound of it. Moses G. Farmer, the electrical inventor, and Howe, the creator of the sewing machine, were his friends. At 5 years of age, little John J. Carty was taken by his father to the shop where the bells were made, and he was profoundly impressed by the magical strength of a big magnet that picked up heavy weights as though they were feathers. At the high school, his favorite study was physics, and for a time he and another boy named Rolf, now a distinguished man of science, carried on electrical experiments of their own in the cellar of the Rolf home. Here they had a Tom Thumb telegraph, a telephone which they had ventured to improve, and a hopeless tangle of wires. Whenever they could afford to buy more wires and batteries, they went to a nearby store which supplied electrical apparatus to the professionals and students of Harvard. This store, with its workshop in the rear, seemed to the two boys a veritable wonderland. And when Carty, a youth of 18, was compelled to leave school because of his bad eyesight, he ran at once and secured the glorious job of being boy of all work in this store of wonders. So, when he became an operator in the Boston Telephone Exchange, a year later, he had already developed, to a remarkable degree, his natural genius for telephony. Since then, Carty and the telephone business have grown up together, he always a little distance in advance. No other man has touched the apparatus of telephony at so many points. He fought down the flimsy, clumsy methods which led from one snarl to another. He found out how to do with wires what Dickens did with words. Let us do it right, boys, and then we won't have any bad dreams. This has been his motive. And as the crown and climax of his work, he mapped out the profession of telephone engineering on the widest and most comprehensive lines. In Carty, the engineer evolved into the educator. His end of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company became the University of the Telephone. He was himself a student by disposition, with a special taste for the writings of Faraday, the forerunner, Tyndall, the expounder, and Spencer, the philosopher. And in 1890 he gathered around him a winnowed group of college graduates. He has 60 of them on his staff today, so that he might bequeath to the telephone an engineering corps of loyal and efficient men. The next problem that faced the young men of the telephone, as soon as they had escaped from the clamor of the mysterious noises, was the necessity of taking down the wires in the city streets and putting them underground. At first they had strung the wires on poles and rooftops. They had done this not because it was cheap, but because it was the only possible way, so far as anyone knew in that kindergarten period. A telephone wire required the daintiest of handling. To bury it was to smother it, to make it dull, or perhaps entirely useless. But now that the number of wires had swollen from hundreds to thousands, the overhead method had been outgrown. Some streets in the larger cities had become black with wires. Poles had risen to 50 feet in height, then 60, 70, 80. Finally, the highest of all pole lines was built along West Street, New York. Every pole a towering Norway pine, with its top 90 feet above the roadway, and carrying 30 crossarms and 300 wires. From poles the wires soon overflowed to housetops, until in New York alone they had overspread 11,000 roofs. These roofs had to be kept in repair, and their chimneys were the deadly enemy of the iron wires. Many a wire, in less than 2 or 3 years, was withered to the merest shred of rust. As if these troubles were not enough, there were the storms of winter, which might wipe out a year's revenue in a single day. The sleet storms were the worst. Wires were weighted down with ice, often 3 pounds of ice per foot of wire. And so, what with sleet and corrosion and the cost of roof repairing and the lack of room for more wires, the telephone men were between the devil and the deep blue sea, between the urgent necessity of burying their wires and the inexorable fact that they did not know how to do it. Fortunately, by the time that this problem arrived, the telephone business was fairly well established. It had outgrown its early days of ridicule and incredulity. It was paying wages and salaries and even dividends. Evidently, it had arrived on the scene in the nick of time, after the telegraph and before the trolleys and electric lights. Had it been born 10 years later, it might not have been able to survive. So delicate a thing as a baby telephone could scarcely have protected itself against the powerful currents of electricity that came into general use in 1886, if it had not first found out a way of hiding safely underground. The first declaration in favor of an underground system was made by the Boston Company in 1880. "It may be expedient to place our entire system underground," said the sorely perplexed manager, "whenever a practicable method is found of accomplishing it." All manner of theories were afloat, but Theodore N. Vail, who usually was the man of constructive imagination in emergencies, began in 1882 a series of actual experiments at Attleboro, Massachusetts, to find out exactly what could and what could not be done with wires that were buried in the earth. A 5-mile trench was dug beside a railway track. The work was done handily and cheaply by the labor-saving plan of hitching a locomotive to a plow. 5 plows were jerked apart before the work was finished. Then into this trench were laid wires with every known sort of covering. Most of them, naturally, were wrapped with rubber or gutta percha, after the fashion of a submarine cable. When all were in place, the willing locomotive was harnessed to a huge wooden drag, which threw the plowed soil back into the trench and covered the wires a foot deep. It was the most professional cable laying that anyone at that time could do, and it succeeded, not brilliantly, but well enough to encourage the telephone engineers to go ahead. Several weeks later, the first 2 cables for actual use were laid in Boston and Brooklyn, and in 1888, engineer J.P. Davis was set to grapple with the Herculean labor of putting a complete underground system in the wire-bound city of New York. This he did in spite of a bombardment of explosions from leaky gas pipes and with a woeful lack of experts and standard materials. All manner of makeshifts had to be tried in place of tile ducts, which were not known in 1888. Iron pipe was used at first, then asphalt, concrete, boxes of sand, and creosoted wood. As for the wires, they were first wrapped in cotton and then twisted into cables, usually of 100 wires each. And to prevent the least taint of moisture, which means sudden death to a telephone current, these cables were invariably soaked in oil. This oil-filled type of cable carried the telephone business safely through 6 years. But it was not the final type. It was preliminary only, the best that could be made at that time. Not one is in use today. In 1885, Theodore Vail set on foot a second series of experiments to see if a cable could be made that was better suited as a highway for the delicate electric currents of the telephone. A young engineer named John A. Barrett, who had already made his mark as an expert by finding a way to twist and transpose the wires, was set apart to tackle this problem. Being an economical Vermonter, Barrett went to work in a little wooden shed in the backyard of a Brooklyn foundry. In this foundry he had seen a unique machine that could be made to mold hot lead around a rope of twisted wires. This was a notable discovery. It meant tight coverings. It meant a victory over that most troublesome of enemies, moisture. Also, it meant that cables could henceforth be made longer, with fewer sleeves and splices, and without the oil, which had always been an unmitigated nuisance. Next, having made the cable tight, Barrett set out to produce it more cheaply, and by accident stumbled upon a way to make it immensely more efficient. All wires were at that time wrapped with cotton, and his plan was to find some less costly material that would serve the same purpose. One of his workmen, a Virginian, suggested the use of paper twine, which had been used in the South during the Civil War, when cotton was scarce and expensive. Barrett at once searched the South for paper twine and found it. He bought a barrel of it from a small factory in Richmond, but after a trial it proved to be too flimsy. If such paper could be put on flat, he reasoned, it would be stronger. Just then he heard of an erratic genius who had an invention for winding paper tape on wire for the use of milliners. Paper-wound bonnet wire! Who could imagine any connection between this and the telephone? Yet this hint was exactly what Barrett needed. He experimented until he had devised a machine that crumpled the paper around the wire instead of winding it tightly. This was the finishing touch. For a time, these paper-wound cables were soaked in oil, but in 1890, engineer F.A. Pickernell dared to trust to the tightness of the lead sheathing and laid a dry core cable, the first of the modern type, in one of the streets of Philadelphia. This cable was the event of the year. It was not only cheaper, it was the best talking cable that had ever been harnessed to a telephone. What Barrett had done was soon made clear. By wrapping the wire with loose paper, he had in reality cushioned it with air, which is the best possible insulator. Not the paper, but the air in the paper had improved the cable. More air was added by the omission of the oil. And presently Barrett perceived that he had merely reproduced in a cable, as far as possible, the conditions of the overhead wires, which are separated by nothing but air. By 1896 there were 200,000 miles of wire snugly wrapped in paper and lying in leaden caskets beneath the streets of the cities. And today there are 6 million miles of it owned by the affiliated Bell companies. Instead of blackening the streets, the wire nerves of the telephone are now out of sight under the roadway and twining into the basements of buildings like a new sort of metallic ivy. Some cables are so large that a single spool of cable will weigh 26 tons and require a giant truck and a 16-horse team to haul it to its resting place. As many as 1,200 wires are often bunched into one sheath, and each cable lies loosely in a little duct of its own. It is reached by manholes where it runs under the streets, and in little switching boxes placed at intervals it is frayed out into separate pairs of wires that blossom at length into telephones. Out in the open country there are still the open wires, which in point of talking are the best. In the suburbs of cities there are neat green posts with a single gray cable hung from a heavy wire. Usually a telephone pole is made from a 60-year-old tree, a cedar, chestnut, or juniper. It lasts 12 years only, so that the one item of poles is still costing the telephone companies several millions a year. The total number of poles now in the United States used by telephone and telegraph companies once covered an area, before they were cut down, as large as the state of Rhode Island. But the highest triumph of wire laying came when New York swept into the skyscraper age, and when hundreds of tall buildings, as high as the fall of the waters of Niagara, grew up like a range of magical cliffs upon the precious rock of Manhattan. Here the work of the telephone engineer has been so well done that although every room in these cliff buildings has its telephone, there is not a pole in sight, not a cross-arm, not a wire. Nothing but the tip ends of an immense system are visible. No sooner is a new skyscraper walled and roofed than the telephones are in place, at once putting the tenants in touch with the rest of the city and the greater part of the United States. In a single one of these monstrous buildings, the Hudson Terminal, there is a cable that runs from basement to roof and ravels out to reach 3,000 desks. This mighty geyser of wires is 50 tons in weight and would, if straightened out into a single line, connect New York with Chicago. Yet it is as invisible as the nerves and muscles of a human body. During this evolution of the cable, even the wire itself was being remade. Vail and others had noticed that of all the varieties of wire that were for sale, not one was exactly suitable for a telephone system. The first telephone wire was of galvanized iron, which had at least the primitive virtue of being cheap. Then came steel wire, stronger but less durable. But these wires were noisy and not good conductors of electricity. An ideal telephone wire, they found, must be made of either silver or copper. Silver was out of the question, and copper wire was too soft and weak. It would not carry its own weight. The problem, therefore, was to either make steel wire a better conductor or to produce a copper wire that would be strong enough. Vail chose the latter and forthwith gave orders to a Bridgeport manufacturer to begin experiments. A young expert named Thomas B. Doolittle was at once set to work, and presently appeared the first hard-drawn copper wire, made tough-skinned by a fairly simple process. Vail bought 30 pounds of it and scattered it in various parts of the United States to note the effect upon it of different climates. One length of it may still be seen at the Vail homestead in Lyndonville, Vermont. Then this hard-drawn wire was put to a severe test by being strung between Boston and New York. This line was a brilliant success, and the new wire was hailed with great delight as the ideal servant of the telephone. Since then there has been little trouble with copper wire, except its price. It was 4 times as good as iron wire, and 4 times as expensive. Every mile of it, doubled, weighed 200 pounds and cost $30. On the long lines where it had to be as thick as a lead pencil, the expense seemed to be ruinously great. When the first pair of wires was strung between New York and Chicago, for instance, it was found to weigh 870,000 pounds, a full load for a 22-car freight train, and the cost of the bare metal was $130,000. So enormous has been the use of copper wire since then by the telephone companies that fully 1/4 of all the capital invested in the telephone has gone to the owners of the copper mines. For several years the brains of the telephone men were focused upon this problem: how to reduce the expenditure on copper. One uncanny device, which would seem to be a mere inventor's fantasy if it had not already saved the telephone company $4 million or more, is known as the phantom circuit. It enables 3 messages to run at the same time, where only 2 ran before. A double track of wires is made to carry 3 talk trains running abreast, a feat made possible by the whimsical disposition of electricity, and which is utterly inconceivable in railroading. This invention, which is the nearest approach as yet to multiple telephony, was conceived by Jacobs in England and Carty in the United States. But the most copper money has been saved, literally tens of millions of dollars, by persuading thin wires to work as efficiently as thick ones. This has been done by making better transmitters, by insulating the smaller wires with enamel instead of silk, and by placing coils of a certain nature at intervals upon the wires. The invention of this last device startled the telephone men like a flash of lightning out of a blue sky. It came from outside, from the quiet laboratory of a Columbia professor who had arrived in the United States as a young Hungarian immigrant not many years earlier. From this professor, Michael J. Pupin, came the idea of loading a telephone line in such a way as to reinforce the electric current. It enabled a thin wire to carry as far as a thick one, and thus saved as much as $40 a wire per mile. As a reward for his cleverness, a shower of gold fell upon Pupin, and made him in an instant as rich as one of the Grand Dukes of his native land. It is now a most highly skilled occupation, supporting fully 15,000 families, to put the telephone wires in place and protect them against innumerable dangers. This is the profession of the wire chiefs and their men, a corps of human spiders, endlessly spinning threads under streets and above green fields, on the beds of rivers and the slopes of mountains, massing them in cities and fluffing them out among farms and villages. To tell the doings of a wire chief in the course of his ordinary week's work would in itself make a lively book of adventures. Even a washerwoman with one lone non-electrical clothesline of 100 yards to operate has often enough trouble with it. But the wire chiefs of the Bell telephone have charge of as much wire as would a switchboard by making a tour of investigation around it. It is not like anything else that either man or nature has ever made. It defies all metaphors and comparisons. It cannot be shown by photography, not even in moving pictures, because so much of it is concealed inside its wooden body. and few people, if any, are initiated into its inner mysteries except those who belong to its own cortege of inventors and attendants. A telephone switchboard is a pyramid of inventions. If it is full grown, it may have 2,000,000 parts. It may be lit with 15,000 tiny electric lamps and nerved with as much wire as would reach from New York to Berlin. It may cost as much as 1,000 pianos or as much as 3 square miles of farms in Indiana. The 10,000 wire hairs of its head are not only numbered, but enswathed in silk and combed out in so marvelous a way that any one of them can in a flash be linked to any other. Such hairdressing! Such puffs and braids and ringlet relays! Whoever would learn the utmost that may be done with copper hairs of Titian red must study the fantastic coiffure of a telephone switchboard. If there were no switchboard, there would still be telephones, but not a telephone system. To connect 5,000 people by telephone requires 5,000 wires when the wires run to a switchboard, but without a switchboard there would have to be 12,497,500 wires, 4,999 to every telephone. As well might there be a nerve system without a brain as a telephone system without a switchboard. If there had been at first 2 separate companies, one owning the telephone and the other the switchboard, neither could have done the business. Several years before the telephone got a switchboard of its own, it made use of the boards that had been designed for the telegraph. These were as simple as wheelbarrows, and became absurdly inadequate as soon as the telephone business began to grow. Then there came adaptations by the dozen. Every telephone manager became, by compulsion, an inventor. There was no source of information, and each exchange did the best it could. Hundreds of patents were taken out, and by 1884 there had come to be a fairly definite idea of what a telephone switchboard ought to be. The one man who did most to create the switchboard, who has been its devotee for more than 30 years, is a certain modest and little-known inventor, still alive and busy, named Charles E. Scribner. Of the 9,000 switchboard patents, Scribner holds 600 or more. Ever since 1878, when he devised the first jackknife switch, Scribner has been the wizard of the switchboard. It was he who saw most clearly its requirements. Hundreds of others have helped, but Scribner was the one man who persevered, who never asked for an easier job, and who in the end became the master of his craft. It may go far to explain the peculiar genius of Scribner to say that he was born in 1858, in the year of the laying of the Atlantic cable, and that his mother was at the time profoundly interested in the work and anxious for its success. His father was a judge in Toledo, but young Scribner showed no aptitude for the tangles of the law. He preferred the tangles of wire, and as a boy his favorite play toy was a telegraph system in miniature, which he and several other boys had built and learned to operate. These boys had a benefactor in an old bachelor named Thomas Bond. He had no special interest in telegraphy. He was a dealer in hides. But he was attracted by the cleverness of the boys and gave them money to buy more wires and more batteries. One day he noticed an invention of young Scribner's, a telegraph repeater. "This may make your fortune," he said, "but no mechanic in Toledo can make a proper model of it for you. You must go to Chicago, where telegraphic apparatus is made." The boy gladly took his advice and went to the Western Electric Factory in Chicago. Here he accidentally met Enos M. Barton, the head of the factory. Barton noted that the boy was a genius and offered him a job, which he accepted and has held ever since. Such is the story of the entrance of Charles E. Scribner into the telephone business, where he has been well nigh indispensable. His monumental work has been the development of the multiple switchboard, a much more brain-twisting problem than the building of the pyramids or the digging of the Panama Canal. The earlier types of switchboard had become too cumbersome by 1885. They were well enough for 500 wires, but not for 5,000. In some exchanges, as many as half a dozen operators were necessary to handle a single call, and the clamor and confusion were becoming unbearable. Some handier and quieter way had to be devised, and thus arose the multiple board. The first crude idea of such a way had sprung to life in the brain of a Chicago man named L.B. Furman in 1879, but he became a farmer and forsook his invention in its infancy. In the multiple board, as it grew up under the hands of Scribner, the outgoing wires are duplicated so as to be within reach of every operator. A local call can thus be answered at once by the operator who receives it, and any operator who is overwhelmed by a sudden rush of business can be helped by her companions. Every wire that comes into the board is tasseled out into many ends, and by means of a busy test invented by Scribner, only one of these ends can be put into use at a time. The normal limit of such a board is 10,000 wires, and will always remain so unless a race of long-armed giantesses should appear, who would be able to reach over a greater expanse of board. At present, a business of more than 10,000 lines means a second exchange. The multiple board was enormously expensive. It grew more and more elaborate until it cost $250,000. The telephone men racked their brains to produce something cheaper to take its place, and they failed. The multiple board swallowed up capital as a desert swallows water, but they saved 10 seconds on every call. This was an unanswerable argument in their favor, and by 1887, 21 of them were in use. Since then, the switchboard has had 3 or 4 rebuildings. There has seemed to be no limit to the demands of the public or the fertility of Scribner's brain. Persistent changes were made in the system of signaling. The first signal used by Bell and Watson was a tap on the diaphragm with the fingernail. Soon afterwards came a buzzer, and then the magneto-electric bell. In 1887, Joseph O'Connell of Chicago conceived of the use of tiny electric lights as signals, a brilliant idea, as an electric light makes no noise and can be seen by either night or by day. In 1901, J.J. Carty invented the bridging bell, a way to put 4 houses on a single wire, with a different signal for each house. This idea made the party line practicable, and at once created a boom in the use of the telephone by enterprising farmers. In 1896 there came a most revolutionary change in switchboards. All things were made new. Instead of individual batteries, one at each telephone, a large common battery was installed in the exchange itself. This meant better signaling and better talking. It reduced the cost of batteries and put them in charge of experts. It established uniformity. It established the federal idea into the mechanism of a telephone system. Best of all, it saved 4 seconds on every call. The first of these centralizing switchboards was put in place at Philadelphia, and other cities followed suit as fast as they could afford the expense of rebuilding. Since then, there have come some switchboards that are wholly automatic. Few of these have been put into use for the reason that a switchboard, like a human body, must be semi-automatic only. To give the most efficient service, there will always need to be an expert to stand between it and the public. As the final result of all these varying changes in switchboards and signals and batteries, there grew up the modern telephone exchange. This is the solar plexus of the telephone body. It is the vital spot. It is the home of the switchboard. It is not anyone's invention, as the telephone was. It is a growing mechanism that is not yet finished, and may never be. But it has already evolved far enough to be one of the wonders of the electrical world. There is probably no other part of an American city's equipment that is as sensitive and efficient as a telephone exchange. The idea of the exchange is somewhat older than the idea of the telephone itself. There were communication exchanges before the invention of the telephone. Thomas B. Doolittle had one in Bridgeport, using telegraph instruments. Thomas B. A. David had one in Pittsburgh, using printing telegraph machines, which required little skill to operate. And William A. Childs had a third, for lawyers only, in New York, which used dials at first and afterwards printing machines. These little exchanges had set out to do the work that is done today by the telephone, and they did it after a fashion, in a most crude and expensive way. They helped to prepare the way for the telephone by building up small constituencies that were ready for the telephone when it arrived. Bell himself was perhaps the first to see the future of the telephone exchange. In a letter written to some English capitalists in 1878, he said, "It is possible to connect every man's house, office, or factory with a central station, so as to give him direct communication with his neighbors. It is conceivable that cables of telephone wires could be laid underground or suspended overhead, connected by branch wires with private dwellings, shops, etc., and uniting them through the main cable with a central office." This remarkable prophecy has now become stale reading, as stale as Darwin's Origin of Species, or Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But at the time that it was written, it was a most fanciful dream. When the first infant exchange for telephone service was born in Boston in 1877, it was the tiny offspring of a burglar alarm business operated by E.T. Holmes, a young man whose father had originated the idea of protecting property by electric wires in 1858. Holmes was the first practical man who dared to offer telephone service for sale. He had obtained 2 telephones, numbers 6 and 7, the first 5 having gone to the junk heap, and he attached these to a wire in his burglar alarm office. For 2 weeks his business friends played with the telephones like boys with a fascinating toy. Then Holmes nailed up a new shelf in his office, and on this shelf placed 6 box telephones in a row. These could be switched into connection with the burglar alarm wires, and any 2 of the 6 wires could be joined by a wire cord. Nothing could have been simpler, but it was the arrival of a new idea in the business world. The Holmes Exchange was on the top floor of a little building, and in almost every other city the first exchange was as near the roof as possible, partly to save rent, and partly because most of the wires were strung on rooftops. As the telephone itself had been born in a cellar, so the exchange was born in a garret. Usually, too, each exchange was an offshoot of some other wire-using business. It was a medley of makeshifts. Almost every part of its outfit had been made for other uses. In Chicago, all calls came in to one boy, who balled them up a speaking tube to the operators. In another city, a boy received the calls, wrote them on white alleys, and rolled them to the boys at the switchboard. There was no number system. Everyone was called by name. Even as late as 1880, when New York boasted 1,500 telephones, names were still in use. And as the first telephones were used both as transmitters and receivers, there was usually posted up a rule that was highly important. Don't talk with your ear or listen with your mouth. To describe one of those early telephone exchanges in the silence of a printed page is a wholly impossible thing. Nothing but a language of noise could convey the proper impression. An editor who visited the Chicago Exchange in 1879 said of it, "The racket is almost deafening. Boys are rushing madly hither and thither, while others are putting in or taking out pegs from a central framework as if they were lunatics engaged in a game of fox and geese." In the same year, E.J. Hall wrote from Buffalo that his exchange with 12 boys had become a perfect bedlam. By the clumsy methods of those days, from 2 to 6 boys were needed to handle each call. And as there was usually more or less of a cat and dog squabble between the boys and the public, with everyone yelling at the top of his voice, it may be imagined that a telephone exchange was a loud and frantic place. Boys, as operators, proved to be most complete and consistent failures. Their sins of omission and commission would fill a book. What with whittling the switchboards, swearing at subscribers, playing tricks with the wires, and roaring on all occasions like young bulls of Bashan, the boys in the first exchanges did their full share in adding to the troubles of the business. Nothing could be done with them. They were immune to all schemes of discipline. Like the mysterious noises, they could not be controlled, and by general consent they were abolished. In place of the noisy and obstreperous boy came the docile, soft-voiced girl. If ever the rush of women into the business world was an unmixed blessing, it was when the boys of the telephone exchanges were superseded by girls. Here at its best was shown the influence of the feminine touch. The quiet voice, pitched high, the deft fingers, the patient courtesy and attentiveness, these qualities were precisely what the gentle telephone required in its attendants. Girls were easier to train. They did not waste time in retaliatory conversation. They were more careful, and they were much more likely to give the soft answer that turneth away wrath. A telephone call under the boy regime meant bedlam in 5 minutes. Afterwards, under the girl regime, it meant silence in 20 seconds. Instead of the incessant tangle and tumult, there came a new species of exchange, a quiet, tense place, in which several score of young ladies sit and answer the language of the switchboard lights. Now and then, not often, the signal lamps flashed too quickly for these expert phonists. During the panic of 1907, there was one mad hour when almost every telephone in Wall Street region was being rung up by some desperate speculator. The switchboards were ablaze with lights. A few girls lost their heads. One fainted and was carried to the restroom. But the others flung the flying shuttles of talk until, in a single exchange, 15,000 conversations had been made possible in 60 minutes. There are always girls in reserve for such explosive occasions, and when the hands of any operator are seen to tremble and she has a warning red spot on each cheek, she is taken off and given a recess until she recovers her poise. These telephone girls are the human part of a great communication machine. They are weaving a web of talk that changes into a new pattern every minute. How many possible combinations there are within the 5 million telephones of the Bell system, or what unthinkable mileage of conversation, no one has ever dared to guess. But whoever has once seen the long line of white arms waving back and forth in front of the switchboard lights must feel that he has looked upon the very pulse of the city's life. In 1902, the New York Telephone Company started a school, the first of its kind in the world, for the education of these telephone girls. This school is hidden amid ranges of skyscrapers, but 17,000 girls discover it in the course of a year. It is a most particular and exclusive school. It accepts fewer than 2,000 of these girls and rejects over 15,000. Not more than one girl in every 8 can measure up to its standards, and it cheerfully refuses as many students in a year as would make 3 Yales or Harvards. This school is unique, too, in the fact that it charges no fees, pays every student $5 a week, and then provides her with a job when she graduates. But it demands that every girl shall be in good health, quick-handed, clear-voiced, and with a certain poise and alertness of manner. Presence of mind, which in Herbert Spencer's opinion ought to be taught in every university, is in various ways drilled into the temperament of the telephone girl. She is also taught the knack of concentration, so that she may carry the switchboard situation in her head, as a chess player carries in his head the arrangement of the chessmen. And she is much more welcome at this strange school if she is young and has never worked in other trades, where less speed and vigilance are required. No matter how many millions of dollars may be spent upon cables and switchboards, the quality of telephone service depends upon the girl at the exchange end of the wire. It is she who meets the public at every point. She is the dispatcher of all the talk trains. She is the ruler of the wire highways, and she is expected to give every passenger voice an instantaneous express to its destination. More is demanded from her than from any other servant of the public. Her clients refuse to stand in line and quietly wait their turn, as they are quite willing to do in stores and theaters and barber shops and railway stations and everywhere else. They do not see her at work, and they do not know what her work is. They do not notice that she answers a call in an average time of 3.5 seconds. They are in a hurry, or they would not be at the telephone, and each second is a minute long. Any delay is a direct personal affront that makes a vivid impression upon their minds, and they are not apt to remember that most of the delays and blunders are being made, not by the expert girls, but by the careless people who persist in calling wrong numbers and in ignoring the niceties of telephone etiquette. The truth about the American telephone girl is that she has become so highly efficient that we now expect her to be a paragon of perfection. To give the young lady her due, we must acknowledge that she has done more than any other person to introduce courtesy into the business world. She has done most to abolish the old-time roughness and vulgarity. She has made big business to run more smoothly than little business did half a century ago. She has shown us how to take the friction out of conversation and taught us refinements of politeness which were rare even among the Beau Brummels of pre-telephonic days. Who, for instance, until the arrival of the telephone girl, appreciated the difference between "Who are you?" and "Who is this?" Or who else has so impressed upon us the value of the rising inflection as a gentler habit of speech? This propaganda of politeness has gone so far that today the man who is profane or abusive at the telephone is cut off from the use of it. He is cast out as unfit for a telephone-using community. And now, so that there shall be no anticlimax in this story of telephone development, we must turn the spotlight upon that immense aggregation of workshops in which have been made 3/5 of the telephone apparatus of the world, the Western Electric. The mother factory of this globe-trotting business is the biggest thing in the spacious backyard of Chicago, and there are 11 smaller factories, her children, scattered over the earth from New York to Tokyo. To put its totals into a sentence, it is an enterprise of 26,000 manpower and $40 million power, and the telephonic goods that it produces in half a day are worth $100,000, as much, by the way, as the Western Union refused to pay for the Bell patents in 1877. The Western Electric was born in Chicago in the ashes of the big fire of 1871, and it has grown up to its present greatness quietly, without celebrating its birthdays. At first it had no telephones to make. None had been invented, so it made telegraphic apparatus, burglar alarms, electric pens, and other such things. But in 1878, when the Western Union made its short-lived attempt to compete with the Bell Company, the Western Electric agreed to make its telephones. 3 years later, when the brief spasm of competition was ended, the Western Electric was taken in hand by the Bell people and has since remained the great workshop of the telephone. The main plant in Chicago is not especially remarkable from a manufacturing point of view. There are the inevitable lumber yards and foundries and machine shops. Here is the mad waltz of the spindles that whirl silk and cotton threads around the copper wires, very similar to what may be seen in any braid factory. Here electric lamps are made, 5,000 of them in a day, in the same manner as elsewhere, except that here they are so small and dainty as to seem designed for fairy palaces. The things that are done with wire in the Western Electric factories are too many for any mere outsider to remember. Some wire is wrapped with paper tape at a speed of 9,000 miles a day. Some is fashioned into fantastic shapes that look like absurd sea monsters, but which in reality are only the nerve systems of switchboards. And some is twisted into cables by means of a dozen whirling drums, a dizzying sight as each pair of drums revolve in opposite directions. Because of the fact that a cable's inevitable enemy is moisture, each cable is wound on an immense spool and rolled into an oven until it is as dry as a cinder. Then it is put into a straitjacket of lead pipe, sealed at both ends, and trundled into a waiting freight car. No other company uses so much wire and hard rubber or so many tons of brass rods as the Western Electric. Of platinum, too, which is more expensive than gold, it uses 1,000 pounds a year in the making of telephone transmitters. This is imported from the Ural Mountains. The silk thread comes from Italy and Japan, the iron for magnets from Norway, the paper tape from Manila, the mahogany from South America, and the rubber from Brazil and the Valley of the Congo. At least 7 countries must cooperate to make a telephone message possible. Perhaps the most extraordinary feature in the Western Electric factories is the multitude of its inspectors. No other sort of manufacturing, not even a government navy yard, has so many. Nothing is too small to escape these sleuths of inspection. They test every tiny disc of mica and throw away 9 out of 10. They test every telephone by actual talk, set up every switchboard, and try out every cable. A single transmitter, by the time it is completed, has had to pass 300 examinations, and a single coin box is obliged to count 10,000 nickels before it graduates into the outer world. 700 inspectors are on guard in the 2 main plants at Chicago and New York. This is a ruinously large number from a profit-making point of view, but the inexorable fact is that in a telephone system, nothing is insignificant. It is built on such altruistic lines that an injury to any one part is the concern of all. As usual, when we probe into the history of a business that has grown great and overspread the earth, we find a man, and the Western Electric is no exception to this rule. Its man, still fairly hale and busy after 40 years of leadership, is Enos M. Barton. His career is the typical American story of self-help. He was a telegraph messenger boy in New York during the Civil War, then a telegraph operator in Cleveland. In 1869, his salary was cut down from $100 a month to $90, whereupon he walked out and founded the Western Electric in a shabby little machine shop. Later he moved to Chicago, took in Elisha Gray as his partner, and built up a trade in the making of telegraphic materials. When the telephone was invented, Barton was one of the skeptics. "I well remember my disgust," he said, "when someone told me it was possible to send conversation along a wire." Several months later he saw a telephone and at once became one of its apostles. By 1882 his plant had become the official workshop of the Bell companies. It was the headquarters of invention and manufacturing. Here was gathered a notable group of young men, brilliant and adventurous, who dared to stake their futures on the success of the telephone. And always at their head was Barton, as a sort of human switchboard, who linked them all together and kept them busy. In appearance, Enos M. Barton closely resembles ex-President Eliot of Harvard. He is slow in speech, simple in manner, and with a rare sagacity in business affairs. He was not an organizer in the modern sense. His policy was to pick out a man, put him in a responsible place, and judge him by results. Engineers could become bookkeepers, and bookkeepers could become engineers. Such a plan worked well in the earlier days when the art of telephony was in the making, and when there was no source of authority on telephonic problems. Barton is the Bishop Emeritus of the Western Electric today, and the big industry is now being run by a group of young hustlers, with H.B. Thayer at the head of the table. Thayer is a Vermonter who has climbed the ladder of experience from its lower rungs to the top. He is a typical Yankee, lean, shrewd, tireless, and with a cold-blooded sense of justice that fits him for the leadership of 26,000 people. So, as we have seen, the telephone as Bell invented it was merely a brilliant beginning in the development of the art of telephony. It was an elfin birth, an elusive and delicate sprite that had to be nurtured into maturity. It was like a soul for which a body had to be created, and no one knew how to make such a body. Had it been born in some less energetic country, it might have remained feeble and undeveloped, but not in the United States. Here in 1 year it had become famous, and in 3 years it had become rich. Bell's invincible patent was soon buttressed by hundreds of others. An open-door policy was adopted for invention. Change followed change to such a degree that the experts of 1880 would be lost today in the mazes of a telephone exchange. The art of the telephone engineer has in 30 years grown from the most crude and clumsy of experiments into an exact and comprehensive profession. As Carty has aptly said, "At first we invariably approached every problem from the wrong end. If we had been told to load a herd of cattle on a steamer, our method would have been to hire a Hagenbeck to train the cattle for a couple of years so that they would know enough to walk aboard of the ship when he gave the signal. But today, if we had to ship cattle, we would know enough to make a greased chute and slide them on board in a jiffy." The telephone world has now its own standards and ideals. It has a language of its own, a telephonese that is quite unintelligible to outsiders. It has as many separate branches of study as medicine or law. There are few men, half a dozen at most, who can now be said to have a general knowledge of telephony. And no matter how wise a telephone expert may be, he can never reach perfection because of the amazing variety of things that touch or concern his profession. "No one man knows all the details now," said Theodore Vail. "Several days ago I was walking through a telephone exchange and I saw something new. I asked Mr. Carty to explain it. He is our chief engineer, but he did not understand it. We called the manager. He didn't know and called his assistant. He didn't know and called the local engineer, who was able to tell us what it was." To sum up this development of the art of telephony, to present a bird's-eye view, it may be divided into 4 periods. 1. Experiment, 1876 to 1886. This was the period of invention, in which there were no experts and no authorities. Telephonic apparatus consisted of makeshifts and adaptations. It was the period of iron wire, imperfect transmitters, grounded circuits, boy operators, peg switchboards, local batteries, and overhead lines. 2. Development, 1886 to 1896. In this period, amateurs became engineers. The proper type of apparatus was discovered and was improved to a high point of efficiency. In this period came the multiple switchboard, copper wire, girl operators, underground cables, metallic circuit, common battery, and the long-distance lines. 3. Expansion, 1896 to 1906. This was the era of big business. It was an autumn period in which the telephone men and the public began to reap the fruits of 20 years of investment and hard work. It was the period of the message rate, the pay station, the farm line, and the private branch exchange. 4. Organization, 1906 onward. With the success of the Pupin coil, there came a larger life for the telephone. It became less local and more national. It began to link together its scattered parts. It discouraged the waste and anarchy of duplication. It taught its older but smaller brother, the telegraph, to cooperate. It put itself more closely in touch with the will of the public. And it is now pushing ahead, along the 2 roads of standardization and efficiency, toward its ideal of one universal telephone system for the whole nation. The key word of the telephone development of today is this: organization. End of Chapter 4 of The History of the Telephone.